webinar. I'm Erin Mullenix. I'm the research director at the Iowa League of Cities and in a shared role with Iowa State Extension, Community and Economic Development Programs. And I'm joined today by Ted Nellison, who is City Budget Director with the Iowa Department of Management. And I'm really grateful for you joining us to help present this webinar. Ted is an amazing resource for cities on this subject. We also have other members of League staff joining us today that might chime in and are certainly helping me with the technical side of Zoom facilitation. So I appreciate that very much as well. We have a couple of housekeeping items, and then I'll go through the agenda and then toss it to Ted to get us kicked off. Housekeeping item number one, we are recording this webinar. We're planning to post it on our website on the Iowa League of Cities House File 718 resource page. I am not the one that converts and posts that to the website, so I can't promise the turnaround time exactly, but I think it's fair to say by sometime next week that'll be posted and available to you. The other housekeeping item would be, we have a large number of registrations for this webinar today. So we are going to use the Q&A feature. So if you have a question, please put it into the Q&A feature. And of course, if we don't get to your question today during this webinar, do not hesitate to reach out by email to myself, Ted, or another member of the League's membership services or legislative team. So with that, I will run through quickly the agenda for today. Ted's going to get us started talking about this, what's in House File 718 that relates to cities. There's a lot of information there. A lot of it's technical and pretty complex. Whoops. So I will provide a high-level summary when he's done, just to kind of touch on and wrap up the key points. I'll walk us through a few examples of Division 2, which we're going to cover in more detail, but that's the ratcheting down of the newly defined general fund levy, and then we'll take your questions. So with that, Ted, I'm going to kick it over to you.
There we go. I had to be unmuted first. Again, Ted Nellison, Iowa Department of Management. Thank you for attending. Hopefully we can convey this information efficiently. There's a lot in this bill. It's a 67-page bill, and it was pretty diverse in the areas that it hit as far as changes. So we're going to go over it kind of division by division to start, just to give you an idea of the changes that could affect your city. There are a lot of different changes, some of them small, some of them rather large. So we'll start with the largest ones up front, or the largest one, I should say, up front, which Erin alluded to, which is the consolidation of city tax rates and the ratchet down provision that is built into the bill. The main idea, or kind of the genesis of this bill as it was described by the Senate, is to get cities back to the 810 regular general levy overall. That's kind of the aim that they were shooting at with this bill, and the way that they set out to do that was by combining a lot of the permissible non-voted and permissible voted general levies of the budget. So if you've done a budget before for a city, you know there's a lot of different one-off type of levies that you could use based on function that were on top of your 810 general levy. So what this bill does first and foremost is it consolidates most of those general levies. There are a few exceptions, but it consolidates most of those general levies with the regular general 810 and the emergency levy into one, what is called a combined general fund levy, or CGFL. So that combined levy takes the majority of those the majority of the regular general emergency, and then the other voted and non-voted permissible general levies, and it combines them into one rate and into $1 amount to start. So that's the very first thing that it does. And then the second piece of it is it takes the yearly growth in non-TIF taxable value of a city and then applies a ratchet down mechanism if certain growth triggers are hit. So what we'd be looking at in terms of value growth, if you want to model it, is we're looking at the line 2A value on the budget form, the non-TIF taxable value with gas and electric. That's the one that's going to be compared from year to year to see what the growth is, to see if triggers are met or exceeded, so that we know if the ratchet down needs to be brought into play. Go ahead, Aaron, if you'd forward. So here's a list of those levy rates that are being consolidated. You can see first and foremost your regular general 810 and your emergency levies. Those are the two most highly used ones amongst cities that are being combined under this. But you can see there's also several others that are being combined. Notably, the ones that are not being combined into this are ones that kind of have an outside mechanism that approves them, such as aviation authority, operation of a public transit, the property liability and self-insurance. That is not part of this. The unified law, because that is governed under another code section rather than 384 and has kind of a different board oversight to it. So some of those levies that kind of have an outside board operating them or are governed by other parts of the code rather than 384, those are kind of excluded. So the most important ones to remember that are excluded are the property liability and self-insurance levy. So your property casualty and your tort liability insurance levy, that is still uncapped and it is not part of the ratchet down mechanism or the CGFL. And then the employee benefits levies. So police and fire retirement, FICA, NIPERS, and other employee benefits, those remain uncapped and not part of the CGFL ratchet down mechanism, along with debt service and the capital improvement reserve levy. Those are excluded from this ratchet down. The ones listed here are included in the ratchet down, and for the most part, so they will cease to exist on their own. So this has important it kind of has important effects for things like the supportive public library levy is one I'll pick out and state in the open. That one had a provision in it that stated if the supportive public library levy had been put in place by a vote of the citizens, it had to be used every year, and then the money would be protected for the library and only usable for library purposes. Once the bill goes into effect here on July 1 for 2025, as far as these levies being consolidated is concerned, that will no longer be the case. So there won't be any protected money by law in the CGFL, and you will not have to levy specifically for a library, because these the subsections under 384.12 that govern these levies are struck from the code, and all of the CGFL money becomes regular general money, allowable for any lawful purpose within the city. So just bear that in mind. It's going to change things a little bit from a planning standpoint. There will be a little bit more discretionary discussion needed at the local level to decide how to use the CGFL dollars, because it won't be compartmentalized like it had been in the past by using these specific other levies. The other important thing to remember is you don't get chopped to 810 right away, right off the bat. It's not like in FY24, you had a $10 levy with all of these combined, and then in 25 you're chopped to 810. That's not the case. The FY24 dollars requested and rate become the base, and then the ratchet down mechanism is applied starting with that bit, whatever your FY24 figures are, that becomes your base, and we start making adjustments from there, and you'll go down over time. The idea is to ratchet it down slowly over time to get you back under 810. And then once it's under 810, there's a little bit of wiggle room to change your rate in certain situations, but we'll go over that here in the coming slides. So go ahead, Aaron.
I have a quick question, Ted.
Oh, sure.
The support for emergency management agency is also excluded, right?
Yes. The support for local emergency management is also excluded from that. If it wasn't on the list on the last tab, it is excluded from the CGFL, and it is not subject to ratchet.
Thank you.
Yep. And you'll want to review and I would strongly encourage you to look through the bill itself. I know a lot of it's written in legalese, and becomes a little hard to follow. But the important thing is I would strongly recommend that you review at least pages, it'd be like pages 10 through, oh boy, I think it's like 10 through 20. 10 through 18. So if you look at pages 10 through 18, it kind of shows you how the code is being restructured. Anything that's crossed off as far as a levy, that's gone from the code and it's part of your CGFL, it's getting rolled in. Anything that's left without a strike through is still on its own, usable as it has been in the past, and not subject to the ratchet down or subject to the CGFL. Okay, go ahead, Aaron.
Ted, we had one more question.
Oh, sure.
Actually, a few questions, it looks like. One person asked that they did not see the library levy on the list. I do think it's there, the last item.
Support a public library. Yep, it's
public
very last
library.
item. Yep.
And then asking if a voted memorial building levy would be consolidated as well.
It is. Yep, top of the second column there.
Okay, and then if they are under 810 now, will we be able to increase to 810 in the future? And I think you're probably going to answer that here in the upcoming piece.
The answer, yeah, the quick answer to that is under certain circumstances, yes, but we'll go over that here in a little bit more detail on this slide. In the future, what you can do and what rates you can go to will be dictated by your non-TIF taxable value growth with gas and electric. So if your line 2A non-TIF taxable value with gas and electric grows a certain percentage, you have a ratchet down applied to your rate for the next year. So there's a couple of different plateaus that you can hit. If you are, if your growth in taxable value, non-TIF taxable value was less than 3%, nothing happens to you other than the CGFL consolidation of rates, and then you're frozen at that rate being your max. So let's say I'm in a city that my taxable value grew less than 3% for FY25, and I was at a $10 consolidated rate between my regular general levy and all the other voted and non-voted permissible levies that I was using. I get locked in at that $10 rate. I cannot go higher than that, that dollar amount. I get locked right there, and that's the highest I can go. Okay, and that gets applied to the next year's, that rate would get applied to the next year's taxable value, and then you would get whatever that outcome is. So if your growth is under 3%, you get locked in wherever you are if you're over 810, and then that rate gets applied forward. You can always come down from that, but that becomes your new max rate. If you're under 3% growth and you're under 810, at that point you get some flexibility, because if I'm at, say, $7 rate, and I'm growing less than 3% in FY25 in terms of taxable value growth, I can then go all the way up to 810, and that can become my new max. So I'm not locked at the $7 I was in the previous year. I get to go up to 810, but that is specific to cities that are in FY24 levying less than 810, and their growth in FY from 24 to 25 in terms of non-TIF taxable value is less than 3%. If you're over 3%, but you're less than 6% in terms of non-TIF taxable value growth, then we apply a reduction factor of 2%. So this does not mean that you are only allowed to grow 2% in terms of your tax asking from one year to the next. We actually kind of trim your growth by 2%, your growth in tax by 2%. So there will be an example here coming up in a couple of slides, and then Aaron will of course go through these a little bit more further in the presentation on how this calculation is made. But basically, if you're over 3% but less than 6%, what you need to know is that you're having a 2% limitation on your growth. So we'll show you in a slide or two how that works, and it'll make a little bit more sense. But we're not holding you to 2% growth. We're actually going to reduce the growth by 2%. That's what the rate, or excuse me, what the code language in the calculation does. If you're over 6% in terms of non-TIF taxable growth from one year to the next, then you get a 3% reduction factor applied, or a 3% limiter applied to your growth. So there's different stages. You're going to have to figure out which stage you're in. So a good idea now would probably be to look at where have you been historically to see where you might end up in terms of growth factor in the calculation. Next year, it's going to be a little bit tricky because, as you've probably seen in the news, there's all the residential growth that's going to be coming online. So we don't really know how that's going to impact, because it's supposed to be statewide double-digit residential growth in terms of assessment. We won't know until, November, December, when the values start coming through our system exactly where you're going to be. But you can start making estimates right now based on where you've been historically, and then we'll have to tighten those up come the fall once we start getting reported, the value reported to us from the counties. Go ahead a slide, Aaron. So we talked about the tiers. Here's the calculation, just in a very simple form. You can go through the code and read it and probably talk yourself silly, not knowing what it means. Here's what it means in real world terms. Current year, so the current year CGFL will be, for the first year, it'll be your FY24 consolidated levies under the CGFL and the associated requested dollars, So we're going to take the FY24 requested dollars, we're going to divide that by the current year's non-TIF taxable value. So the FY24 non-TIF taxable value times whatever your reduction percentage is. So if your city grew under 3%, then we don't factor this at all. If your city grew 3 to 6%, we would take your current FY24 non-TIF taxable value and multiply it by 1.02, because you get that 2% limiter. If you grew more than 6%, we take your FY24 non-TIF taxable value with gas and electric, and we multiply it by 1.03%, or 1.03, excuse me, a 3% limiter. So we take your current FY24 CGFL consolidated requested dollars. So that's the request with utility replacement column on your budget. Add all those together and then divide it by the FY24 non-TIF taxable value on line 2A divided by the 1.02 or 1.03, depending on which tier you're in. And then we multiply that outcome by 1,000 to get a rate that you will be allowed to assess for CGFL in the next year, in FY25. Okay. We then take that outcome, that rate, and apply it against your budget year, your FY25 non-TIF taxable value with gas and electric, same as always, to get the revenue that you're going to get for that year. Then at that point, it becomes normal operation within the tax formula. So we take the outcome rate, the budget year CGFL rate that we calculated using the formula outlined in the code, and then we apply that to your actual non-TIF taxable value with gas and electric divided by 1,000, like we would in any year, to get to the requested dollars that you're allowed. Now, the good news is you won't have to do this math on the budget forms. The budget forms that we are developing currently will do this for you. We'll have it once your value is reported by the county into our system in December. This will be waiting for you when you come into the form for the first time. It'll be sitting there waiting for you once the valuations have been reported. So we'll do that math for you. But if you want to model it out for next year and for future years, there's the formula you need to follow. Down below, you can see an example. So in this particular city, we had, if you look under the budget non-TIF taxable on the right column, they grew from current year to budget year. It went from 4.1 billion in value to 4.4 billion in value, which is a growth of 7.9%. So they're in the top tier. This city would be top tier and they'd get the 3% reduction. That's why on the left-hand side, you can see 3%. Okay. So they're going to get that 3% reduction limitation put in place on them. So the way we figure that is we take their current CGFL request of 25 million, that's the second column there on top, that 25 million figure, and we divide it by their current non-TIF taxable value, which is the 4.148 million, divided by 1.02, or excuse me, times 1.02 or 1.03, excuse me, because this is a 3%. So you take that 4.1 million times 1.03, and then you divide the 25 million by that outcome. So the CGFL restricted taxable is that number. It's the 4.1 billion in terms of current year non-TIF taxable times the 3% limiter, 1.03. You get 4.2 billion. So then I take the 25 million request dollars from current FY24 current year, I divide it by that restricted taxable, and I come up with a rate of 5.873. That's down below in the first column. That's budget CGFL rate down below. So then I take that rate and I apply it to the budget non-TIF taxable value of 4.4 billion, and I end up with 26,293,591 for my request for the next year, which would be a growth of 4.76% over the previous year. So you can see here, if we had held the rates constant at 6.05 into the next year and just rode the assessment growth, you would have gotten 7.9% more dollars in the next year than the previous year. Under the limitation calculation, the city will only get 4.76. So it's about a 3% reduction, not a 3% limitation. We didn't hold the city to 3%. It's just they got their potential general fund tax dollars reduced by 3% to that new figure. All of this calculation, like I said, will be done in the form for you. If you're under 3%, no calculation is done. You're just stuck with you're stuck at the rate that you had in the previous year as your max. If you're at between 3% and 6% non-TIF taxable value growth, you get a 2% limiter. If you're over 6% growth from year to year in terms of non-TIF taxable value with gas and electric, you get a 3% limiter. So you can see it's a bit of an intricate calculation. Once you do it a couple of times, it's not that bad. You'll see that the calculation is actually pretty straightforward, but to see it written in the code is a little bit crazy. So you're going to want to take a look at the league's resources and the resources that I'll be putting out later this year if you're looking to model this, so that you can get a good handle on how this calculation works.
Sounds good, Ted. We've got quite a few questions for you.
I'm surprised by that. It was so clear.
Right.
But Ted, also thank you very much for stating that you're planning on being able to do the math within your budget form. I think that's very helpful to folks as well.
Our budget form will do the math for you. So once the value, and the thing to remember is on that point, once the value comes into our system, you'll see the number. Until the value comes in, so we'll release our forms, hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll still release our forms early December like always. So when the first time you come in, you might see a 0 there. Don't freak out. Doesn't mean you're not going to get anything. It probably just means that all of the value for your county or counties hasn't been reported yet. Once the value is reported by your county or counties, then you'll see a number flow in. That's the way that we're planning it. Currently building it, should have it ready this fall for review. So watch out in DOM and league communications coming up to give you an idea of what that's going to look like.
Okay, Ted, we're going to throw some questions your way, and then we'll get back to your slides as well.
Okay.
The first one, so even if a levy was voted, like the memorial levy, you can choose to use your new CGFL on other items that fall within the levy purpose going forward. I think.
Yeah, the voted part of it no longer exists because it gets struck from 384.12 of the code. Which was the section that stated the usage, the specific usages. So that goes away, and this becomes just regular general fund, any allowable purpose, any lawful purpose type of money. So silver lining there is it might free up what you can do with the money a little bit versus the strict pots that you had to put it in previously to use those other permissible levies. So yeah, that goes away because the code sections that govern that get struck from the code altogether.
Okay, and the next one, if non-affected, example, employee benefits causes the tax rate. Oh, now I'm jumping over. To go over 810, is that okay? So that would
Yeah.
also be
Yeah.
yes.
We still have add-ons, the ones that I mentioned earlier that are not capped and are not part of this ratchet down, because here we're only talking about the ones that are subject to CGFL ratchet down. You want to go back a couple of slides, Aaron, to the list,
You bet.
because it might be helpful to see it again. So these levies are the only ones that are going to be subject to this limitation. They're going to get clumped together into the new combined general fund levy, and then they'll cease to exist on their own as part of the code. They get struck from the code. The CGFL language becomes the new governing language of the code. All of that money becomes regular general type dollars permissible for any use. So these just go away. The ones not listed here, the big ones there are aviation authority, operation of a publicly owned transit, the property liability and self-insurance levy, the employee benefits levies, and debt service levy. All of those maintain exactly as they are. So you get to add them on after the fact. The ones that have a cap still have the same cap. The ones that are uncapped are still uncapped. They are not changed in any way by this bill. They get to add on after the fact. So can you go back to the example slide that we were just on?
You bet.
So for example, in this city, there we go. So in this city, where we hold their CGFL rate in 25 to 5.8, they still get to add on after the fact with their debt service levy, with their tort liability, property casualty insurance, with their other employee benefits. So their overall rate is not held to 5.8. That's just their general fund money is held to 5.8. And then we expand from there with those other uncapped levies, and they add on top the same way they do now.
Okay, next question is, theoretically, could there be a city that grows at 2.9% and does not get the reduction factor applied, while another city could grow 3.1 but be forced to apply that reduction factor? So that is yes.
Just like any place where you set an arbitrary goalpost, you're going to have some winners and losers. 2.9, they would maintain, and then the 3.1 would potentially get cut. So there are areas where you may see some outcomes that are different, even though you're only 0.01% away from each other. That's the way it goes anytime you put in one of these goalposts.
Okay, next question. Will there be additional examination done to ensure that the rollback error doesn't recur in future years, and perhaps a bit of communication in an appropriate time frame with taxing entities if it does?
I would assume that a lesson has been learned from the Senate File 181. That's Department of Revenue's calculation, and I'm not privy to their discussions on how they plan to go about it in the future, but I would anticipate that they're probably making some changes to their process going forward, and will be a little bit maybe different in how they approach the calculation and how they double check the calculation. I would hope, that being said, like I said, I'm not privy to those discussions, but I would hope that we wouldn't have an outcome like SF 181 again. I'm hoping for myself, selfishly, that we don't have that outcome, because it's a couple of years of that might kill me, but hopefully we won't have that outcome again now that it's known. That came because of a law change, right? It wasn't just, things stayed the same from year to year to year and boop, they just screwed it up. It was an interpretation of a law change. There was a difference of opinion in interpretation of a law change, and that became the outcome that needed to be adjusted. It needed to be clarified. So that's kind of why we got SF 181. There's not that kind of law change to the assessment side, to the rollback side of the property tax formula this coming year or any years in the near future. So we shouldn't have a repeat of the same problem. Now that that's been ironed out, it should hopefully be smooth sailing from here.
And Ted, just for the folks on the webinar today that might be unfamiliar, Senate File 181 was a separate bill.
That was a separate
what we're
bill,
talking about today.
and that was the corrective. That was the bill that corrected the value and corrected the rollback percentage on residential class property. So they had an issue last year where they were combining. There was a piece of legislation, just as a quick review. I know everybody probably knows this already, but just as a quick review, there was a piece of legislation passed in a previous session that combined residential and multi-residential classes of property and got rid of the multi-residential class. Whereas prior to that, multi-res was going to continue to exist. It would just get residential's rollback percentage alone. Like, so instead of having its own rollback percentage, it would be tied to residential and it would get whatever residential gets. When they combine the classes, some of the language wasn't as clear as it needed to be as far as how was the calculation going to be carried out. Because if you blend those two, you get a different outcome than if you just run residential by itself and multi-res. So that had to be ironed out. And that's what led us to Senate File 181, which made clear that you get the residential percentage applied to the entire residential multi-res new creation. And then that's why we had to make a change to the rollback percentage early this year. That, again, like I said, is the outcome of a law change, and we shouldn't have that unless we shouldn't have the threat of that unless there's another law change kind of equivalent to that causes some problems. Otherwise, from here on out now that they set that first year of residential and multi-res together, it should be a straightforward calculation of rollback like it has been in the past.
Okay, the next question, can we use all new growth in the calculation going forward, or are we penalized for that growth by it being lumped in with the previous value?
All of the value gets treated the same under this because we don't separate the new growth from the existing reval. For the next set of years, all of the valuation that you have in your city, you get to access and use as you had in the past. It's just also that comes in on the calculation side of it too. So if you have a bunch of new value growth that comes in as non-TIF taxable value with gas and electric, that's going to be part of your value growth that goes towards figuring out which of those levels you're in as far as the ratchet down mechanism. Are you less than 3%? Are you 3 to 6? Or are you above 6? So that's where the value will come in. Once that's done, the property tax formula kicks in as it always has. So you get your full value, reval plus new, multiplied by the rates to determine your amount of requested tax dollars. So that part of it's the exact same. There's no differentiation in how new value versus revalue is treated under this law.
Okay, the next one, is it a 3% reduction, or is there growth effectively being limited to 3%? And so that would be a 3% reduction.
It's an around
to
3%,
the
around 2% reduction. So it's not, so if you were growing 12% from one year to the next in terms of taxable, non-TIF taxable value, you will not be limited to 3%. You will be reduced by 3% down to around 9%. So you'd go from 12% growth in terms of at the same rate applied against your taxable value growth. You would grow 12%. We limit it down to 9, not down to 3.
Year to year.
That's year to year. Every year it resets. So it's not cumulative over a number of years. We look at every single year individually with this calculation and say, okay, what was last year's dollars? What was last year's rate? What is next year's growth? Then we do the calculation. And then after that, we just set it all up again for the next year and redo the whole thing, just looking at 1 year next to the next year.
Okay, next
and it's
question.
a reduction, not a strict limitation.
Okay, thank you. Next question, will the Department of Management or the League do a calculator in Excel for preparation planning, say calendar year ahead of fiscal year 2025?
Undetermined yet. We're still, I'm going to be quite honest. I'm going to be quite honest. I had to reread this stuff this morning to remind me of what this even is. I'm still in FY24 mode with the budgets. I'm not done with that stuff yet because of the delay. Another thing SF 181 did was it delayed the submission deadline through April 30. So that shoves all of my normal spring work back 2 months, or a month, I should say, month and a half in some cases. So I'm still working through FY24 city budgets and getting them all certified. And yes, I know end of the fiscal year is Friday and I'm horrified by that, but that's where I'm at. So I haven't even looked at building one of these. Aaron and I talked about it a while ago as far as how we're going to approach that. But there hasn't been any hard plans yet. But I mean, there will be plenty of resources, even if it's not in the form of a spreadsheet, But I'm sure there will be some modeling component, but there will be plenty of resources for you to build your own. And I've looked at enough of them from some local governments who got to jump on this to know that people are building their own, and it's not too bad. You could do it yourself.
Okay, the next question, Des Moines County and cities have had 2 years of declining value. Is there any way to get this factored in? Everything I have seen says no, only the growth going forward, and I think that's correct.
Yeah, it's growth from year to year. So historical doesn't matter except for setting our base for calculating into the next year. But if there's been declining growth, the ratchet down wouldn't affect it because you'd be less than 3%. So you would just get locked in at whatever your rate is currently and whatever your dollars are currently. That your rate would become locked in at, that would be your max rate going into the next years. That would be the only effect if you're in decline. But we don't, it's not a historical, it's not a cumulative, like Aaron was saying earlier, this is year by year. We just look at 1 year to the next and say, what was the growth? So it doesn't really account for past, declines at all.
Okay, the next one, I know the budget form will do the math for us. I'm just curious if someone were to ask me questions now about it.
I guess I don't follow. I missed the question there. Is it just?
I think the question would probably just be maybe how to look at that now before the budget forms are ready.
Well, yeah, there's resources already out on the league's website, as Aaron mentioned earlier. There's a HF 718 page that states, here's the calculation, here's how it's done. So you can reference that. It also breaks down the bill and the various parts of the bill that affect cities. So all of that language is there. If you have someone who is asking questions about it, you can point them there. There's no real hard and fast thing we can say about FY25 because we don't even have taxable value for that. We won't have it until December. So all of it right now is very theoretical. You can kind of show them how the calculation works and point them towards those resources. We'll have more resources over the summer, over the fall, as we really get into this. I'm working with I have another working group of county auditors and assessors and their software companies to set up some parts of the bill that some of the other parts of the bill. And as we work through that process, we'll have output from that that'll be relevant to cities that I'll send out. Also, I'm working on the budget system part of this. And until we get that in place, we won't have a lot of resources yet. But as we put those pieces in place, we'll start sending out more and more resources. So that'll start later this summer, probably in July. And as we move forward, you'll see more and more resources come out to you. So that's kind of a to be determined thing yet. But the league's page is there as a good resource for you if you get questions. And then obviously you can talk to me or Aaron.
Yeah, absolutely. The next one, I had thought that actual growth and then additions and new were to be separated from revaluation growth. Is this only in the notice sent out or also in our calculations?
Stick a pin in that. We'll get there. That's okay, coming up.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
The next one says no question, but just a comment, and it's related to your slide that's on the screen. It is interesting. The goal of the legislation was to get the new general fund levy to $810, but the example reduces $6.05 levy to $5.87.
Secondary goal of the legislation to reduce the tax burden on citizens. So that's what you're seeing here.
Okay, and the next one says, would Ted consider releasing a sample calculation tool? I think you just covered that one as well.
It sounds like we're going to be either Aaron or I, but we'll work on that once I clear the 2024 budget stuff that I'm currently working on. Then we'll get into that in more detail. Safe to say we'll probably release some form of modeling assistance for you into the next year.
Okay, the next one, to make sure I track, for communities that have 1 to 2% taxable growth, if we have the CGFL that fell below 810 for fiscal year 25, will it be allowed to return to 810, or are we permanently stuck with each CGFL decline as our new ceiling?
As you have taxable value, non-TIF taxable value growth of less than 3%, you're allowed to go up to 810. So if you're under 810, if you get ratcheted down under 810, and then you have a year where you have less than less than 3% taxable value growth, yes, you're allowed to go back up to 810. That becomes your new max in the situation where you're not in one of the two tiers, right? So if you're under 3% taxable, non-TIF taxable value growth with gas and electric from one year to the next, you are allowed flexibility to go back up to 810. So if the ratchet down took you all the way down to like 5.8, like we see $5.87 in this example, but then the next year you grow less than 3%, this city would be allowed to go back up to 810 from 587. That is written into the bill.
Okay, and also related to this example slide, in your example, the CGFL rate of 587 becomes the current CGFL rate for the next budget year. So that's right.
Yes, that is correct.
And let's see. Oh, okay. If we do not currently use the insurance, employee benefits, or debt service levy, will we be able to add them? That's still yes.
Yep. The flexibility to use those doesn't change. The rules for when you can use those doesn't change.
Okay. As we continue to grow, is there a floor as to how low the legislature is setting our local property tax rate through an automatic rate calculation?
This one doesn't have a built-in floor. So if you are lucky enough to have wildly high growth, it will just keep ratcheting down over the years, it kind of in proportion to your growth. So if you continue to grow, more than 3% a year over year, the ratchet will continue every year.
Okay, and the next question relates to a previous question where we talked about a city with 2.9% growth versus a city with 3.1% growth. So, so they ask in the winners and losers comment that we made about that question, a 2.9% growth city gets to keep that growth, whereas a 3.1% city gets roughly 1.1% growth. So yes.
It's possible. Yeah. I mean, that is a possible outcome that you could see.
Okay.
Yep.
Is fiscal year 24 the deciding year for all 5 years? For instance, if we have no growth, then fiscal year 25 is stuck at the same rate. But if fiscal year 26 we have growth, will we still be stuck?
Like we said, it's 1 year isolated. We don't factor in other years. So you take your current year and you compare it to your next budget year and see what the growth factor is going to be. And then you make a calculation based on that. So you could have years where you're frozen at the same rate, and then the next year you could get a ratchet down. That totally can happen because this is figured year by year by year. We don't look at it historical. It's just what is this year compared to next budget year, and then make the calculation. So yes, every year will have a different impact. You'll have a different ratchet, or you'll have potentially no ratchet depending on your growth.
So the next question, so effectively a rate could never go up once it has been driven down, even if there's a decline in valuation. So that one I do not think is the case.
No, because if you're under 810 and you have less than 3% growth, you're allowed to go back up to 810. So that would be the situation where you can have growth. Now, if you're over 810 and you grow less than 3%, you're not allowed to increase until you're back under 810. And then you can increase back up to 810. So if let's say we have an example of a city that's over 810, but they had less than 3% growth. So let's say they were at 10 for their CGFL rate, and they grew less than 3% from 24 to 25, they would be stuck at the 10. That would be their max, and that's where they would stay until they have enough growth to get a ratchet down. And then until they're under 810 and they have less than 3% growth, then they get the flexibility to go back up to 810. But those are the only scenarios where you would see an increase. If you're over 810, you're going to be stuck where you are, or you'll be ratcheted down. If you're under 810 and you're less than 3% growth, then you can go back to 810, but no higher. That's kind of the two scenarios that you'd have.
And to clarify, for fiscal years 29 and forward, if you were to be under 810, you could go up to 810 if your leadership decided to do that.
Yeah, and the 29 is an important year. I don't anticipate that we'll get there because I think that's probably put in there as a motivator to do more work on property taxes. But there is a provision that the ratcheting mechanism sunsets in and I think it's FY29.
Mhm.
So that would be the first year where you would not see a ratchet, but then everybody gets put at 810 as a max. So if nothing else is done to change this code as it's structured, we come to the end of the ratchet down period, which is built into the code. You would get slammed from wherever you're at if you're still above 810 down to 810. So if I'm doing ratchet downs for the next 4 years, and then I'm still above 810, even after all of those ratchet downs, because I've just not had much growth. Once that the end of the ratchet down mechanism comes in code, then you would get put down to 810 automatically by that year. And I think it's FY29 would be the first year where that happens. Yeah, on or after July 1st, 2028. So that would be FY29 would be the first year where you could get slammed from wherever you're at above 810 down to 810 if nothing else is done to change that.
So Ted, there are still a lot of questions coming in.
Yeah, we're gonna have to aggregate
about
those.
15 minutes left, and I know you have a lot of good information left, and I still have some to share. So
Yeah.
I'm going to pivot back to the slides, but we don't want to not answer the questions. So please feel free to contact us, offline if we need to get those answered. And the league will be providing more opportunities in the future to answer those questions.
Yeah,
So
and Aaron, I think if we could, we can probably aggregate those questions too and just answer them offline and send it out.
Absolutely.
So I think that's how we can handle that. And also just remember, this is the beginning of the conversation, right? This is the first real rollout attempt for us to explain this to you. It will by far not be the last. My dance card for the summer is filling up. As far as speaking engagements on this, there will be plenty of opportunities to go over this again as we go from summer into fall. So don't worry if you're still a little hazy on it at the outcome of today. I would expect that. I read this bill countless numbers of times until I got it. So don't feel bad, especially with Division 2, the calculation part. That's going to take some time to get comfortable with, but you will have the time to get comfortable with it, and we will have many more opportunities for you to learn about it as we go. That's something that the league and I are working together on, getting opportunities out there, and the Iowa State Association of Counties, ISAC, and I are working on getting opportunities for you to come and learn some of this stuff again. So we will go over it probably ad nauseum, and you'll be sick of it by the time we're done. So don't worry about that. Okay, so let's talk about some of the other divisions that come into play. Division 5 is immediate, and it has a big impact. So just like Division 2 goes into effect for FY25. Division 5, which is the homestead exemption, which is a whole new concept, that goes into place for assessment year 23, fiscal year 25, and then it ramps up to its full amount for assessment year 24, fiscal year 26. So what this is so the homestead credit stays as it is. So, anybody who owns a first home gets a homestead credit, or the opportunity to claim a homestead credit by going to your assessor's office and applying for it, right? Your county assessor, you go in, you make an application, they give you a credit. That credit becomes basically value that gets removed from the calculation of your taxes. So that happens right away when you purchase your home and you apply for homestead. That credit piece still in place. The new piece is the exemption piece. So people who are 65 and older, homeowners who are 65 and older, now can get a credit and an exemption. So a credit refers to a credit against taxes paid. So your bill gets reduced, your tax bill gets reduced. An exemption is a removal of value from the calculation. So instead of having all of your value in on the calculation and then giving a credit against your bill to say, okay, we're kind of like a coupon, we're going to remove part of your cost. This takes it out of the value side so that we're actually calculating taxes against less value. It's $3,200 or $3,250 is the first phase in of exemption. So they exempt $3,250 worth of value in AY23 for homeowners 65 and older. And then in 24 and forward, it becomes $6,500 worth of value that gets removed and exempted from the tax calculation for all homeowners 65 and over. They also do not have to the homeowners are not supposed to have to apply for this. They're supposed to get it automatically. The one question has been, how do we identify who's 65 and who's not? Because the homestead application in the past did not have a birth date requirement on it. So we're still, Department of Revenue is working with county assessors to figure that piece out. If you have a loved one that's above 65, you might want to just tell them to talk to their county assessor's office and make sure they know, hey, 65 or older, so please give me this credit or this exemption. So that is a furthering, the credit's still in place, but this is a further option if for people 65 and older on their homes. They get this further homestead exemption. And again, that goes in place for next budget year right away, FY25 in part, and then in total for FY26 and forward, that will be in place. But that is all, that's nothing for you to do, nothing you have to figure. That all happens at the county level. And so on the taxable value that you get on your budget, that will already be figured in and you won't have to worry about it, but be aware because this will be a reduction that you will see in terms of taxable value for homeowners 65 and older. Military exemption also stays in place, kind of similar to as it has been, only it gets increased. So it currently stands at $1,852 unless you are a World War I vet, which I don't believe we have anymore. Unfortunately, we're far enough away from that conflict that most of the veterans have passed away at this point from World War I. So I think anything after World War I, it was $1,852 worth of exemption of value from a home. So that goes up to $4,000 starting next year, AY23, FY25. So again, that'll be exempted off of the taxable value when you get value into your budget. That will already be figured in. Nothing for you to do as a city except for recognize that this is going up and it will be a further reduction of taxable value from what you would have had under the past law. Division 8 is highly specific. And it really only affects, at this point, City of Des Moines and Des Moines Area Regional Transit. So this provision allows for a franchise fee above 5% to be used to offset the tax rate of a regional transit authority. So this really, like I said, is tightly tailored. It's only for cities over 200K in population. Of course, Des Moines is the only city in the state currently that's over 200K in population. So this allows City of Des Moines to continue to assess their franchise fee above 5%, which they were allowed to do that due to the outcome of the Craigness case. And now that allows the continuance of that should the city choose to. And then that extra 2.5% above 5 has to be paid to DART. This is the only use that can be allowed for it, is it gets paid to DART and DART has to use it to reduce fees. As we have cities grow into the 200,000 area, this could become available to other operators, but right now it's a very unique provision and it really only applies to City of Des Moines and DART. So most of you can ignore it. It is available next year, City of Des Moines, just a heads up. Division 7 is going to have some impact across the state. So urban revitalization is chapter 404. So we're not talking urban renewal and TIF. We're talking urban revitalization and tax abatements, okay? So if you have a chapter 404 urban revitalization area where that's the theory behind urban revitalization is homeowner or business owner makes an improvement to the property and their taxes are on that improvement are abated for a period of time. Usually it's a sliding scale for 10 years or 5 years. And it goes from like 100% or 80% down to zero in terms of how much tax gets removed from their bill. And it's only on the improvement part. So if I have somebody who has a home that they build onto, only the built on part gets this tax removed from it. The change that's being made, so that stays the same. There's two changes that are being made to that. If you're doing a new application for a commercial property to get an abatement, there has to be a minimum assessment agreement attached to it. Okay, so all new commercial abatement agreements have to have a minimum assessment agreement attached to them. Starts in FY27, so there's a little bit of ramp up time. The other part of it is residential. So residential properties that there is a new abatement application and agreement starting with FY27, that budget year. The school rate gets applied to the property, because currently your abatement means no taxes are collected or no rate is applied to the new piece of property, or only 80%, 60%, whatever your scale down is, you apply that much of the improvement gets the full rate applied to it. All of the rest of it gets exempted from all of the rates. This changes it so that new applications after July 1 of 2024 for abatement of a residential property, the school rate will always apply. There's no way to abate the full rate as it's been done in the past. Schools will get their full rate against it, and schools are 40% of the overall consolidated rate or more. So this will have an impact. It will give schools another funding source, but it also limits the effectiveness of the abatements going forward residential, because it's going to allow not for a full abatement. Basically, you're going to only allow for a partial abatement now of the property tax, because they'll still have to pay for the school rate. And that's the total rate, not just the uniform levy, because in the past there had been some floated proposals that said, oh, well, why don't we just allow them to take the uniform 540 levy and still apply that? This one, the full school rate applies. So if your school is assessing a rate of $17 per thousand, that $17 per thousand gets assessed to new urban revitalization agreements July 1, 2024 and after. So bear that in mind. Going forward, you got a little bit of time to implement this change, but that's a change that's going to have to be implemented when you start up new urban revite areas, or if you have existing urban revite areas where you have a new application for abatement. It applies either way. It depends on when the application is made, not when the area is designated. Okay, Aaron, go ahead. All right, here's a big one. This is a big one, and it affects every single city. And it's going to be a major change from how we do things. So Division 10, there's a new max levy process, essentially, for lack of a better term, right? 384.15a, which governs the current max levy process, is being struck by this bill. And put in its place will be a new add-on to chapter 24, I think it is. I'd have to look again, but it's a new add-on for cities, schools, and counties. So schools get included in this one too. That's kind of the new wrinkle. Cities and counties before had to do max levy. And again, as a refresher, max levy was you had to go and hold a hearing with proper notice prior to doing the rest of your budget to state, here's what our tax rate is going to be, or our maximum tax asking for the next year will be, right? So you had to have a separate hearing with a separate resolution approving it before you could really even start in earnest on your budget. You had to go to the citizens and say, here's what we plan on taxing for in the next fiscal year at max. We may come down from it if you know things break right, but this is a max we'll ask for. You had to get that approved up front, and then you could move on. This takes place of that process. So now, instead of having to do just a publication and a hearing and a resolution, now there's a mailing component that gets put into it. The good news for cities is the only thing you have to do with this mailing is get your information into our system on time. The county auditor is responsible for mailing all of the notices. So you as a city do not have to mail, you know, thousands of individual notices to taxpayers. You simply have to have all of your tax information, property tax information in our system by a certain date. And then that will transfer to the county, who will then make the mailings for you. You can see these mailings as shown on the screen. The mailings are robust. A lot of stuff is required. The good news for you is only thing you really have to provide to us will be your rates for the next year. So you'll basically have to do your property tax page by the beginning of March. So that's a change from max levy. Max levy only covered certain rates. Now we're asking for all rates. So you got to figure debt service earlier than you're used to, because we need this by basically the beginning of March in order to get it to the county in a timely fashion, because they have to mail it by March 20th. Now this says it has to be to us by March 15th, or to the county through us by March 15th. I'm going to beg begging on bended knee that you do it much earlier than that, because counties, the 5 days is not enough time for them to do a mailing, right? So if we give them information on March 15th, they have to get it mailed by March 20th. They're working with their vendors right now to figure that out. But the general consensus that I'm getting from my county partners is that is not enough time. So the earlier you can have this done, the better. I would ask you to have it done beginning of March, by March 10th, hopefully at the latest, so that you get your information into our system. The biggest change is you got to just basically fill out the full property tax page rather than just the selected items that were on max levy. Now it's requesting your full tax rate and your full tax dollar, your full requested tax dollars, the max that you're going to be asking for. Everything else on here, aside from the hearing information, will come from DOM. So if you put your rates into the system and you put in your time, date, place for the hearing on this max levy that you're going to still have to hold, we will do the rest. We'll put in all the previous year information. We'll put in all of the current year information based on your rates. We'll hand that over to the county auditor. The county auditor will do the mailing. The important thing is you've got to have your budget year tax rates figured out and reported to us, along with the time, date, and location of the max levy hearing that you still have to have. You do still also, in addition to this mailing, you do still also have to publish, a notice of public hearing for this max levy hearing. So the hearing requirement stays, the publication requirement for the hearing stays. Of course, our system will provide you with a hearing notice, same as it has in the past. The real change is you've also got to give the county all of this information so that they can make a mailing. We will do most of the work on this. You've just got to do it in our system. Obviously, we don't have that built out yet, so I don't know what it's going to look like exactly. But you can pretty much figure that you're just going to have to fill out the property tax page, and then we'll transmit that information to the county along with your time, date, and place. So we'll have a modified max levy page for you as well, so that you can transmit that time, date, and place information for the notice, and so that you can create your own publication notice, because you still have to publish this in the paper if you're 201 and above in population, or post in your 3 locations if you're 200 and below. That part doesn't change. The other part that changes is this hearing, this new max levy hearing, has to be separate and distinct from other meetings. Okay, so you can't hold it like we normally did for max levy as the first part of a regular council meeting. This has to be a separate meeting unto itself. It cannot be in a meeting where anything else is discussed except for tax rate. That's a wrinkle. That's a new wrinkle. So you can't tag it on with any other meetings. You can have it on the same night as other meetings. So you could do it as a separate meeting, separate and distinct from any other city business, and just do it earlier or later than your regular council meeting. So if I'm having my regular council meeting at 6 o'clock at night, that same day at 5 o'clock at night, I could have this rate meeting. And just another weird wrinkle is you no longer have to pass it via resolution. So you just have to have the hearing on the rate, take in the comment, and then act on it as part of your budget adoption. So there's not a resolution to be passed as an outcome of this hearing. But the key points are you've got to have your mailing items to us, which is your tax rates, your prospective tax rates for the next year, your time, date, and place of the hearing. That all has to be in our system, not later than March 15th. And again, I beg you, please have it in much earlier than that. I would like beginning of March. March 5th is a good date to target so that we give the counties as much time as possible to create the notices and mail them out, because they have to mail them to every single taxpayer inside your jurisdiction. And it has to show the city, the county, and the school's rate information and meeting information on this notice. So there's a lot of coordination that has to happen between DOM and the county officials in order to get this out correctly. Can you flip to the next one, Erin?
Sure. As we flip to the next slide, I just want to acknowledge we are already 4 minutes over, but we do have still quite a bit of information to cover. So we will be, we'll go ahead and roll through the additional information. Totally understand if folks need to drop off, if they've got other time commitments. We will make the recording available as well as the questions that continue to roll in. So with that, please go ahead.
Well, so here again shows that the county auditors have to have this mailing out by March 20th. That also means that when you set your time, date, and place of your hearings, be sensitive to that March 20th date. The whole point of this mailing is essentially to get bodies in the building for the hearing, right? That's the intent, is to make it more widely known that there's going to be a hearing on property taxes. Please show up. So you want to set your hearing date so that it's at least, after March 20th. And I would say put it at least 10 days after March 20th would be what I would say, or at least 5 days after March 20th. So there's a chance that the mailing gets there before the hearing. That is not required by the bill, but it just makes sense. It's kind of common sense as to what this is supposed to do. As a result of this mailing and its requirements, deadlines for budget submission for all local governments are permanently moved back to April 30th as they were this year. Okay, that also means that budget protest deadlines. So if somebody wants to protest your budget by petition, they will have until May 10th. So all of our timelines at DOM and at your county are really getting shrunk down. Okay, so you need to make sure that you do everything perfectly as you go, because you're really only going to get one crack at this. There's not a lot of time to correct things after the fact, should we find something wrong with your process. So take extreme care to make sure that you're doing it correctly the first time. Most of this mailing process will be handled by DOM and the counties. Your pieces on the front end, tax rates, meeting time, date, and place, those all have to be in. And again, remember, even though the mailing's going out, you still have to do a separate publication or posting, depending on your size. And that has to be done not less than 10, not more than 20 days prior to the date of the hearing. That hearing has to be separate and distinct from any other city hearing, any other city meetings, but it can be on the same day as a regular city meeting. It just can't be the same meeting. It has to be on its own. I'm sure we have questions on this, Erin.
Yes, we do.
So we will, we'll hopefully, are we going to just take those and
we are
answer them
going
after?
to send those out afterwards to,
Okay.
we're going to compile the questions that you all have put in the Q&A that we have not answered. And then when we send out, when we post to the website with the recording, we will also compile those there.
Yeah, so keep those questions coming. That is a wildly new process for any of us, cities, counties, or DOM. We're all going to be in this boat together, and we got to help each other out. It's collaborative. It is not combative. So we need to help each other meet this requirement, because it's going to be new for all of us. None of us have ever been in this territory before. So just get the questions to us, raise points that you see that might be an issue. We'll take any, questions or criticism on that process, because it will be helpful to us since this is all new territory. Okay. Big issue for the cities coming up, or big changes, not really an issue, but big changes for the cities coming up will be in debt issuance. So if a city is issuing a debt that requires election, that can no longer be held at special elections throughout the year. It has all been consolidated under this bill to being held in the November election, a regular November election. So it used to be you could put it on with like a special school election, or you could put it on with special other elections. Now it's all consolidated, and it has to be put onto a regular regular November election, excuse me. This starts on July 1, so Saturday. Any new votes that are going to be, any new debts requiring votes after July 1 upcoming on Saturday, we'll have to adhere to this new November deadline as far as when the vote can happen. There's also a change to the published notice of debt that has to happen for both essential corporate purpose and general corporate purpose. So voting usually is general corporate purpose, right? Because that's where you have the set parameters for how much debt you can issue before you have to take to a vote of the people. So most of your vote stuff is going to be general corporate purpose, but essential corporate purpose is also covered by this new language that has to be in the published notice of issuance. So in this published notice of issuance, you have to include an annual, so this is the exact language from the bill, an estimate of the annual increase in property taxes as the result of this bond issuance on a residential property with an actual value of 100,000. So that's 100,000 prior to rollback would be actual value. It's 100%, 100,000 of assessed value. So that has to be included in any published bond issuance notice. So review that. If you're going to issue bonds later this year, make sure that you review that and that you're adhering to that on both essential corporate purpose and general corporate purpose bond issuances. Go ahead and move to the next one. Further changes to the debt issuance process is that our DOM is actually going to be required to do a more robust reporting to the legislature on local government debt, city debt, county debt, school debt. So your AFR is going to be changed to kind of accommodate this. It's not going to be a giant change. It will basically mean adding an extra page to the AFR that'll be very similar to what you fill out in the long-term debt schedule of the budget. So we're going to ask for a lot more granular debt detail than we have in the past on the AFR. Okay, so it'll be very similar to the long-term debt schedule. We'll ask for each individual issuance that the city has outstanding, the amount of issue, the purpose of it originally. One of the big wrinkles is going to be it will ask whether or not it was approved via an election of the citizens or a council vote. So was it kind of general or essential in nature? And then what the outcome of that vote was, the date of issuance. A lot of it is the normal information that you already report on the AFR or the budget. So it'll look very similar to the long-term debt schedule on the budget, but beware, not starting this year, but starting next year for FY24's AFR, you're going to see this new page. I don't believe we'll have it in time. I would like to do it for 23, but it's not required under code, and I don't think we'll have the time to get it in. But just keep that in mind. That's going to be coming. Another thing that's brand new for DOM, I've never had to do this before. The thresholds of general corporate purpose bonding prior to vote moved up. So you actually got an increase in the amount of debt, general corporate purpose debt that you can issue before you have to take it to a vote of the citizens. So you can see there, they go by population of your city at the last official census as to how much. Now you can issue, if you're 5,000 or less, you can issue 520,000 worth of new debt without taking it to a vote. 5,000 to above 5,000 to less than 75,000, you get 910,000, and then 75,000 above, you get 1.3 million. The biggest part of this that's a change is that will be updated yearly based on the CPI factor every January, starting January 1 of 2025. So I've got 18 months to figure out how I'm going to do this. But DOM is tasked with reporting, with issuing a new schedule of debt issuance thresholds every January, starting January 1, 2025, and it will be updated, adjusting using a CPI factor outlined in the code. So bear in mind, starting January 1, 2025, yearly, you're going to have to check those debt issuance thresholds for general corporate purpose to make sure that you're issuing at the right, or you're using the right guidelines, because those will shift yearly or may shift yearly. It doesn't mean necessarily that they will. But they will likely shift every single year. Okay. And then also we have to, like I said, we have to report now to the General Assembly on debt by December 1st each year. So quicker you can get your AFRs done, the better for me, I guess, is the plug to make there. So try to get your AFRs done early enough that I can make a good report to the legislature by December 1. Hopefully I can get them to move that back, but that's what it is right now. But the AFR, the new AFR information will give us everything we need there. Now, previously, it had been brought up that the bill makes a change to how taxable value and assessed value will be reported by the county to the state. Okay, so Division 9 is this section that talks about new construction value versus revaluation value. In the future, so we won't be reporting this until next assessment year. So assessment year 24. So the January 1, 2024 figures. So it won't apply until fiscal year 25, 26. If at initially, it won't have any impact on budgets at all. In this bill, there is nothing predicated on these numbers except that we have to start collecting them. And all we're doing is we're collecting taxable and assessed value by how much of it is reval, so how much of it is existing property that has been revalued versus how much is new or added value that didn't exist in the city before. Okay, so we'll be collecting that starting with next assessment year, and that data won't be available until the FY25-26 budget. That's the way it's looking right now. We're going to implement changes that will allow for collection of this data quicker than that, but like I said, this bill does not make any budget changes based on this separated reporting. It just requires us to start collecting these two categories of taxable value. What you will end up seeing on your budget will not change until they make further code changes to apply it to the budget. It's just, be aware, we're going to start collecting this. And if people start looking at this data differently, it could have outcomes for your budget in future years. But for right now, all you have to know is that we're going to be collecting it, and that's it. It won't otherwise have any impact on you under the current law. Go ahead, Aaron.
Okay, well, now we're going to shift to, thank you very much, Ted, by the way. The summary level slide, I am just going to leave that slide deck or slide in the slide deck so you can refer back. It just wraps up at a summary what Ted's already covered. So in the interest of time, since we are over, I will leave that there. But I will talk just briefly about Division 2 because it's so important. Ted talked about the new combined general fund levy, and just wanted to share that it will be those levies and the revenues generated from them will be impacted for most communities. I just kind of took a little snapshot from Legislative Services Agency's fiscal note on this. They reported that if you look at fiscal years 2017 to 2023 as a history, of course, we're going forward and you all are looking at making projections, but if we just look at what history did, had this gone into place in fiscal year 2017, 96% of cities would have experienced at least 1 year of tax-based growth above the 3%. So they would have their general fund levy impacted from that perspective. And I pulled out a little quote there, and you can see the piece of the actual fiscal note below, but a significant majority then can expect to see their property tax rate trimmed for at least one of the 4 years in the bill from fiscal year 25 to 28. So now I'm going to walk through a few city examples, and I know Ted already shared on his screen one of those. But if we look at the blue box, those are the assumptions for this city, and step through that ratcheting process and what that would look like for 3 cities. So city A, we're going to assume is a medium growth city. So for all of the fiscal years impacted by the ratcheting process, so that's fiscal years 25 to 28, I'm making the assumption that the city grew at 4%. So they fall into the second tier, which is a city that has between 3% and 6% growth for their non-TIF taxable valuation with gas and electric, but minus ag. So that can be found on line 2A of your budget certification page. So I'm going to use line 2A as my shorthand, but that's what it's going to refer to as that non-TIF taxable with gas and electric, but minus ag. So this city, for example purposes, has $1 billion in line 2A valuation for fiscal year 24. If we apply that 4% assumed growth, they would be at $1.40 billion. And we just start them off, and I picked this number at the 810. So if we looked at their fiscal year 24, that's the baseline year for calculating the new adjusted combined general fund levy. That's your ACGFL. And I think in other places it's just CGFL. So not to confuse, those are the same. But the 810, so for example, this city may have just been using their 810 levy and not the other levies that Ted talked about in a slide that are going to be combined. And if we move to the yellow shaded box, that's the formula to derive the next year's maximum for the combined general fund levy, so the new levy. For 25, we look at the previous year, which is the baseline year of 24. So 1,000 multiplied by then the ratio, the property tax generated the previous year by that baseline combined general fund levy divided by 1.02 in this case, because the city grew between 3 and 6%, and then multiplied by the line 2 valuation in the previous year. So then I've got below that how the math works out. calculates to $7.94 for fiscal year 25. So if we assume that City A then had the same 4% growth for each of the following years with the ratcheting process, that goes to 778 in fiscal year 26, then to 763, and then finally for fiscal year 28, 748. And then I'll make the note that beginning with fiscal year 29, if nothing else happens legislatively, 29 and forward, if they're under the 810 maximum, and this is calculated year by year for their new combined general fund levy, they could go up to 810. If they were in a position where their levy rate was above 810, they would then be restricted to 810 for fiscal years 29 and forward. So the impact of this on our example City A, previous to House File 718, so previous law, let's just assume that their new combined general fund levy stayed at 810 for each of those years, just making that blanket assumption just for example purposes, would generate about $35.8 million for those 4 years combined. But if we assume the rates that we calculated on the previous slide under House File 718, the same City A would generate about $34 million for those cities, those fiscal years combined. So the year-to-year difference is about a 2% reduction in revenue growth for each of the 4 years, which Ted already talked about was part of the intent of the legislation. But if we looked only at fiscal year 28 and compared that alone, the difference is about 9.4%. And the reason that that's higher than the 2% year to year is because of that compounding effect. So in fiscal year 25, they would have had a 2% reduction in revenue growth, and then the same for each of the 4 years. So it would actually, if we just looked at the final year of the 4-year process, we would see about a 9.4% difference for that year. If we took a look at the 4-year totals in terms of expected revenue generated and summed those all up for the 4 years and compared previous to House File 17 to the rates that we calculated in the previous slide, then that difference is about 5.2% for City A's example. And I'll note the note below that says this example assumes that they use their new maximum. Cities can choose a rate lower than their new calculated maximum if they would like to. It assumes the tier 2 growth rate for each year for City A, which is between the 3 to 6%, and uses approximately due to the reduction in the levy, it generates approximately a 2% reduction in revenue growth. And then, of course, if the city fell below that 3% in any given year and had their new adjusted combined general fund levy rate under 810, they could choose to go up to the 810 limit for that year if their leadership so chose. So I'll move now to City B's assumption. City B is a low or no growth city. So their line 2A valuation, again, that's their non-TIF taxable with gas and electric, but minus ag for fiscal year 25 as the baseline year was $50 million. So it's a smaller city. And I'm just going to assume that this city had zero growth, but they were not declining or increasing for budget year, fiscal years 25 to 28. So then for fiscal year 25 to do the calculation, they're still at $50 million. And I'm just assuming a baseline adjusted combined general fund levy of $8.50. And how and that's just made up for the example purposes. But one way that might come into play that it's $8.50. This city might have been in fiscal year 24 at their 810 general fund levy limit. They might have had their 27-cent emergency levy, so that would be get them to 837, and then they would have an additional 13 cents in other levies that were combined. So, for example, maybe their support for their public library brought them to 850. So then City B, because it fell below either of the tiers or categories that would have impacted their new general fund levy, they can simply keep their fiscal year 24 baseline rate when they look at fiscal year 25. So they can go up to that as a maximum and not above it. And of course, they can choose anything lower than that if they wanted to. So, and then the note again, in fiscal year 29, if nothing else changes, they would be subject to the 810 maximum for the combined general fund levy, as are all cities. So they would have to drop in that year down from 850 to the 810 maximum. So then because of that, the impact for City B is more challenging to predict because the impact will depend on their starting point. Since I made up the 850, that's going to be different for every city that falls into that scenario. And City C's assumption, we're going to assume that they are a high growth city. Their line 2A non-TIF taxable valuation minus ags, we're going to assume is at $3 billion, and that this city grows at 7% each year from fiscal year 25 to 28. So for fiscal year 25, calculating that out, we've added the 7% in, and their valuation would be about $3.2 billion. And then again, I just kind of made up their baseline rate at 837. So for example purposes, this city had an 810 levy and used their 27-cent emergency levy in fiscal year 24 as a baseline. So that's where they started for this example. The yellow shaded box is their formula to derive their fiscal year 25 maximum based on the 24 baseline year. So 1,000 again multiplied by the property taxes generated in the previous year by the combined general fund levy, the new general fund levy, and then divided by 1.03 because they fell into that third tier. Any city over 6% growth in their line to evaluation would see an approximately 3% reduction in revenue growth by means of this formula to calculate the levy rate. So 1.03 in the denominator multiplied by the line to evaluation in the previous year. So then the math is there of how that calculates out to be about $8.13 for fiscal year 25. So they started off their fiscal year 24 baseline for the new general fund levy at 837. They go to 813 for fiscal year 25. Then if the same city C had 7% growth for each of the following years, they would go to 789 in fiscal year 26 to 766 and then 744 for fiscal year 28. Now, if any of those years they happen to be under the 3% growth trigger for the tier 2, they could pop up to 810 for that year if their leadership chose that. And then I'll make the note that if nothing else changes right now, fiscal year 29 and going forward, they could go up to the 810 maximum that applies to all cities. So the impact of the revenue generated by City C is there in the green box. If we looked at before House File 718, and we make the assumption that they stayed at 837 for each of those 4 years, they would generate about $119 million for those 4 years combined. But if we assume the rates calculated in the previous slide under House File 718, and using those same assumptions, we generate about $111 million for those 4 years combined. So the year-to-year difference again is about the 3% reduction in revenue growth for each of the 4 years. And if we looked at fiscal year 28 alone and compared it, the difference there is about 11%. And again, that's due to the compounding factor that they would be seeing the 3% reduction in revenue growth for each of the 4 years. And so the difference in 4-year totals, if we sum together the revenue that we anticipate from this projection, would be about 7.3% difference. And with the same important note that this assumes the city uses their maximum calculated, they can choose something lower than that. It assumes that they're in the tier 3 growth rate, meaning that their line 2A valuation grew by 6% or more per year. And of course, if they fell below the 3% and they had their adjusted CGFL rate under 810 in any given year, they could go up to the 810 limit for that year. So that was a very quick run through of those examples. And I do want to share some additional resources where to look for information before we close out. I know that we're well over time, so thank you for sticking with us. The League's website, we have a dedicated page on the League's website for House File 718, and we're going to keep that updated as we roll along. We'll be posting the recording and the follow-up Q&A questions to that site as well. In the June issue of Cityscape, there is an article with really a summary level of this information out there for you. And that's also posted to the same House File 718 resource page on the League's website. The League's new laws publication will be coming out very soon in the July issue of Cityscape, and also posted to our website, and we'll have information about House File 718 as well. Department of Management, as you all know, TED is an excellent resource for our communities. Very much appreciate all the great information you covered today in the webinar and support that you provide our cities, but also know that you can look for more information from the Department of Management as well. Again, the recording of this webinar, potentially an additional webinar or video recording to come in late summer to fall timeframe. I know that there are several upcoming events where Ted or I or another speaker will be talking about this bill. As Ted put it, I think his dance card, it was filling up for the summer and fall to provide information on this topic. The League's budget workshops is certainly one of those. We will be covering this in good detail during that series. And we are planning an update to our special report on property taxes later this fall or winter that will cover House File 718, as well as a look at changes to property tax through state legislation over the past 10 or so years. So looking forward to that as well. With that, I'm going to wrap things up and want to thank you all for attending. Thank Ted Nelson very much from the Department of Management for joining us today. Our emails are on the screen. Feel free to reach out to either of us or a member of our League membership services team or legislative team as well. Again, thank you very much for joining us today.